You've been sitting there every evening for months." The old man looked up slowly. The young woman stood at the fence, still in her scrubs, a bag over one shoulder. "Yes," he said. "Waiting for someone?" A long pause. The evening light settled gold across the porch. "Someone used to come home at this hour," he said quietly. "I suppose I never told myself to stop." Aldous Merritt was 65 years old and lived alone in the house on Crestfall Lane, the one with the two porch chairs facing the garden. Both chairs were always outside. Both cushions slightly faded from years of sun. Only one was ever used. He had lived there 28 years. Long enough to watch the oak tree in the yard go from a sapling to something that threw real shade. Long enough to remember when the evenings on this porch had been full. His wife Celestine beside him, his son Broderick between them as a boy, later across from him as a young man, all three of them watching the day go down together. That had ended 6 years ago. Not cleanly, not simply. Families rarely end cleanly. There had been arguments, the kind that start about money and end about everything else, about choices Aldous had made when Broderick was young, about silences that had stretched too long, about a version of the past that Celestine and Broderick had seen differently than Aldous had. Broderick had left for Germany with his work. Celestine had followed Broderick, not permanently, she'd said, just to help him settle. She had never fully come back. She had died in a hospital in Frankfurt 2 years later, a stroke that came without warning on an ordinary Tuesday. Aldous had been told by phone. He had sat in the kitchen for 3 hours before he could make himself stand up. Broderick had not called for 8 months after that. When he finally did, the conversation was careful and short. They were two people standing at the edge of something neither knew how to cross. Aldous had said, "I'm fine." Broderick had said, "Good," and that had been most of it. So Aldous sat on the porch every evening at 6, because that was the hour Celestine used to come home from her garden club. Because Broderick used to appear at the top of the lane at that hour when he was 17, backpack swinging, still young enough to wave. Because the body keeps its habits long after the reasons are gone. The young woman's name was Fenley Oakes. She was 26, a nurse at Carver Memorial 3 miles away, and she had moved into the house next door 8 months ago to be closer to work. She had noticed Aldous on her third evening home, sitting in that chair, very still, watching the lane with the particular attention of someone who is not really watching anything at all. She had not said anything for months. She was not the kind of person who rushed toward other people's silences. She had grown up with a father who needed quiet the way some people need air, and she had learned early that presence was sometimes more valuable than words. But one October evening, returning from a double shift, with her shoes still carrying the particular weariness of 12 hours on a hospital floor, she had stopped at the fence and asked. He told her simply, without decoration. The evenings, the three of them, the garden, the way Celestine always brought out a glass of water for him without being asked. The way Broderick used to argue about baseball standings with the specific passion of a teenager who believed his opinions were original. "And now?" Fenley asked. "Now it's just the chair," Aldous said, "but it helps to sit in it. I can't explain that very well." "You don't have to," she said. She stood at the fence a moment longer. Then she said good night and went inside. But the following evening, she came out at 6. She set one on the fence post nearest his chair. "I'm just sitting on my step," she said. "You don't have to talk." He looked at the mug. "Thank you," he said. She sat on her step. He sat in his chair. The evening came down slowly around both of them, and neither spoke much, and it was not uncomfortable. This became a quiet pattern over the following weeks. Some evenings they talked. Aldous told her about Celestine, her garden, her laugh, the way she pronounced certain words slightly wrong and refused to be corrected. Fenley told him about the hospital, about patients she'd cared for, about the particular weight of being present for people on their hardest days. "How do you carry it?" Aldous asked one evening. Fenley looked at her mug. "You just do, and then you come home and sit outside for a little while and let the air take some of it." Aldous looked at her. Yes, he said softly. That's exactly it. What Fenley had not told him, what she told her colleague Rosamond one evening at the nurse's station, was that she had started looking up Aldous' son. Not in any invasive way. His name had come up once, when Aldous mentioned it, and she had simply remembered it the way she remembered things that mattered. Broderick Merritt, working in Germany, estranged from a father who sat outside every evening, waiting for a family that was no longer there. She hadn't done anything with this. She wasn't sure it was her place. Rosamond, who had been a nurse for 19 years and had learned to trust the instincts of kind people, said simply, "You'll know when it's right." The letter came to Aldous on a Wednesday in November. He didn't recognize the return address at first. A forwarding service, a German postmark. He opened it at the kitchen table, slowly. It was from Broderick. 4 pages, handwritten. The handwriting was Broderick's. Aldous would have known it anywhere. The slight leftward lean, the careful capitals. He read it twice. Broderick had written that he'd been contacted by someone who knew his father. That the contact had been brief and respectful, only saying that his father was well, and that some distances were worth reconsidering. He had not known who'd written until the second paragraph, where the person had signed simply, "A neighbor who thinks he's worth knowing." Aldous sat with the letter for a long time. Then he walked next door. Fenley opened the door in her off-duty clothes, still tired from the morning shift. She looked at his face and understood immediately. "I didn't ask his permission," she said quietly, before he could speak. "I wasn't sure if I should have." Aldous looked at the letter in his hand. "He's coming," he said. His voice was thick. "He's coming in December." Fenley pressed her hand to her mouth. "I just thought," she began. "I know what you thought," Aldous said, "and you were right." December came gray and cold to Crestfall Lane. On the evening Broderick arrived, Aldous sat in his chair on the porch at 6 o'clock, same as always. The lane was quiet. The oak tree stood bare against the winter sky. A car turned at the top of the lane. Aldous watched it come slowly down the road. It stopped in front of the house. A man got out, taller than Aldous remembered, older in the face, but carrying himself in a way that was unmistakably familiar. They stood looking at each other for a moment across the garden gate. Then Broderick said, "I should have called sooner. But you're here now." Broderick opened the gate. They walked inside together, into the warm kitchen, into the careful beginning of something that would take time and honesty, and more than one conversation to rebuild. But it had begun. That was what mattered. It had begun. From next door, Fenley watched the light come on in Aldous' kitchen window. She stood at her own window for a moment, her tea going warm in her hands. Then she sat down in her chair, and for the first time in a long time, the evening felt like enough. Some people hold a chair for someone who may never come back, not from stubbornness, but from love that doesn't know how to let go of its habits. And sometimes the kindest thing a neighbor can do is quietly, gently, without making a fuss, help someone find their way back to the door they left open. Kindness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just writes a letter and waits. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Let's spread more stories of kindness and hope together.